one of my mentors in this work was a very famous educator in engineering. In fact, the MIT Engineering School, beside being very well known, is quite famous in the history of engineering education, because starting in the 1930s, it began to pioneer, at that time, a very radical idea. Prior to that time, engineering education was a trade education. People were learning how to build things. But a man who was the dean of the engineering school, a man named Gordon Brown, said, things are really changing. The pace of scientific advance is accelerating dramatically. Therefore, engineers should be trained in science first, because otherwise their skills will become outdated very quickly. Now today, that seems like a very obvious idea to us. Engineering schools all around the world are science-based. But in the 1930s was a radical idea. Gordon used to have a very wonderful way of kind of expressing to me the fundamental imperative as educators, and in a sense, Nicanor had a different way of saying the same point. He said, to be a teacher is to be a prophet. To be a teacher is to be a prophet, because you are not preparing kids for the world of today. You're not even preparing them for a world you can imagine. You're preparing them for the next 50 to 75 years. And your responsibility is to always be thinking of that future as best you can, even though we know none of us knows with any certainty what that future will be like. The irony is, schools almost everywhere are almost the opposite. If you look at school as an institution compared to business as an institution, the obvious difference is, if you're in business, you have to innovate. This business has to continually innovate. They have to keep figuring out new ways to design their store, new ways to attract people. Because in business, if you don't innovate, you die. Why isn't that true in schools? It's almost the opposite. And I'm not talking about the Philippines now, I'm talking about everywhere. School tends to be an extremely conservative institution. I don't mean that politically. I mean very anchored in the past. Why? Because we all went to school. Right? We're the anchors. Every one of us. We really know what school should be like because it was such an important institution in our own development. And consequently, school tends to be almost the opposite of what it needs to be. Rather than being really innovative, it tends to be very conservative. Rather than being really forward-looking and imagining that future that's going to be the future those kids are going to live in, it tends to be very backward-looking. That's a deep dilemma, a deep problem. Before we go any further, you should, of course, all, I'm sure you do know this, I'll just say it explicitly. I, of course, know absolutely nothing about the Filipino schools or the school system or the politics of education in the Philippines. The school is always a very political institution. I don't say that critically. It's just the nature of school everywhere. So let me just first ask you a couple of questions that will really help me in knowing how to focus. First off, how many of you are teachers? Okay, for those of you who put your hands up, are you teachers in primary and secondary education or university tertiary education? Primary and secondary? Okay, how about college, university, tertiary? Okay, good. Now, several of you did not raise your hands. Are you also involved in education? How many of you in total, in one way or another, see yourself as primarily educators from a professional standpoint? Okay. Workshops, okay, so adult education, you might say, okay. How about administration? Do we have many people here who are principals, superintendents? Okay, so you're in educational administration. Okay, great. So I'm going to depend upon you a lot today, and I think this morning should be primarily a conversation. And the reason I say that is not only because it'll be a lot more interesting for you and for me as well, but again, school is a very local institution in a way. The expectations of schools are the expectations of a society for good education. So you can't really understand schools unless you understand the society. You understand the history. You understand the traditions. You understand the issues that people are concerned with today. School is also a public institution. Now, obviously, there's two different types of schools. There's in U.S., we would call public and private. Different places in the world use different language. But basically, schools are either paid for by the government out of tax revenues, or schools that are paid for individually by parents. And you have a mix of the two all around the world. right? In Philippines, roughly what percentage of kids in primary and secondary school are in public schools paid for by the government? Is it 20%, 50%, 80%, just roughly? More in public, so much more than 50%. More like 80%. Okay, good. So that's very much like the United States in that sense. What's the current graduation rates, roughly, around the country? How many children complete secondary education, roughly? For the public schools, particularly. About 6 million graduate every year. And what percentage, in other words, if you start as a child, what are the odds you'll complete secondary education? 80%, 90%, 50%? Below 50. Below 50 complete secondary education. Okay, good. So that really helps me get it. When I was a student, 30%, only about 30% complete secondary education. Okay, good. So that just gives me a bit of a feeling. Right now, the other basic question that will help me also get connected with your reality is, what would you say are some of the primary questions or issues or concerns amongst the Filipino people about education? Now, I know that's a very broad question, and I'm not asking you to be an expert. But just your experience as a citizen in this country, your experience as a parent, a teacher, an administrator, we're all connected. The one other thing that's very interesting about schools, we're all connected to schools. If we're not professional educators, we have kids in school. We have grandkids in school. We have friends who have kids in school. So it is really an institution that permeates our conversation, you might say our consciousness as citizens. So if we were to start talking to people in the Philippines, what are your primary concerns about education today? What do you think people would be saying? Resources. How well funded are our schools? Okay. What else? Shortages.
Shortage of classrooms, teachers, materials.
Shortage of classrooms, teachers, and materials. What else? Pardon me? Quality of education. If we asked people, in what ways are you concerned about quality of education, what sort of things do you think would come out? Are we globally competitive? Okay? Are our teachers well trained?
Are the principals?
Are the principals well trained? Nutrition. Oh, interesting. So that's really a public concern. They haven't. A lot of kids maybe haven't eaten that day. Okay, good. In addition, probably even in some ways more interesting, is one of the most interesting movements in urban schools, particularly poorer inner-city schools in America, is urban farms. Many, many schools now grow vegetables. Now, I've been around a lot of people who are part of these programs. You almost never can have a big enough plot of vegetables in your schoolyard to feed all the kids. So normally the way they do it is the kids get involved in the growing the vegetables, but then they connect with local farmers to supply lots of natural produce to the schools. But of course the kids are learning themselves what's involved. There were surveys done several years ago in America that a large percentage of kids living in cities in America thought their food came from the grocery store. They literally thought the food came from the grocery store, because there it is. They had no concept of agriculture, no concept of farming. Of course, in the United States, we have 3 or 4% of our population lives on farms, because we're so far down that urbanization process. And the kids, particularly kids living in cities, have no contact with the larger rural environment. So anyhow, just an interesting development, and I would like to say, I want to use it as an illustration of some very interesting developments, little bits and pieces that I think are the beginnings of what truly could be, and in my opinion really needs to be, a fundamental shift in how we think about primary and secondary education. Now, I'd like to share a few things with you now that I have a little bit of a feeling for the reality of your situation, of what I see happening. I'll try to keep this relatively brief so that it can be a background for us talking together. but having worked in and around schools now for almost 2 decades and being connected with some remarkable networks of innovators in public education particularly, because like you, in my country, over 80% of kids are in public government-funded schools. So while it's great to have innovative private schools, it doesn't really help the society. In fact, it can really work counter, because sooner or later, all the parents who have enough money take all those kids and put them in private schools, and it cuts the resource base to the public schools. Plus, there's no real public support, because you take a lot of parents basically out of the system. They no longer have a sense of responsibility or concern for the schools. So I think all innovation in school has to be focused in the public school sector. It's absolutely vital, because that's where most of the kids are. And I believe that's actually starting to happen. I love that quote of Gordon Brown's, to be a teacher, you have to be a prophet. Because I think that's always true. But it's especially true in times like this. What you saw in the little video is one very clever way to help point out to us the reality. This is a unique time in history. I don't think, in fact, as far as any of us could know, human beings have never been in this sort of predicament. We are actually living in the world. We are living in a way that for the first time in human history, human beings are actually becoming part of the Earth process. Now, if you think about it, that's what climate change means. That's what acidification of the oceans means. That's what the destruction of ecosystems around the world means. For the first time in our history, we have such an impact all around the world that we are literally altering basic biological, ecological processes of the Earth. Throughout human history, people living in any place had to be mindful of their impact on that place. So there are many societies that don't last too long. Even though they may attain tremendous wealth and progress, they destroy their local environment. They harvest too many trees, they destroy the soil, they wipe out the water quality or the animal population, and sooner or later it affects them. So that's why you see in the history of civilizations all the time, they grow, they flourish, they collapse. A few don't. A few grow, flourish, run into troubles, and understand, and come back. So obviously this is a time to learn from the long-lived civilizations. How have they come to understand that? In North America, the Indians, what we would call the Indians, the native peoples in the northern plains, that's Canada and the northern central part of the United States, all say that their history is 15,000 years old. Here's what the kids do in this school. At the age of 5 and 6, they spend typically about 2 hours a day doing calligraphy to understand the creative process. They all do Tai Chi, understand the mind-body system. They all study traditional Chinese medicine. 5, 6-year-olds, all studying traditional Chinese medicine. And they do what the Chinese called recitation, which really was the cornerstone of the intellectual cornerstone of traditional Chinese education. They recite out loud the classics. They recite Confucius, they recite Mencius. Okay? They recite Guangxi. They recite all these classics of Chinese literature. Now you say, well, what does a 5 or 6-year-old understand? And the answer is very, very little. However, and I'm sure many of you understand this, because the Chinese language system is a tonal language system, if you listen to the children, you'll understand immediately what they're doing. For almost 2 hours a day, they're chanting. So yes, they don't understand what the meaning of a lot of what they're chanting, but they're engaged in a field of energetic harmony collectively, because the foundation of the education system was understood to be understanding the mind-body system. And of course, probably many of you know this, in traditional Chinese culture, the symbol for mind is the heart. So when we say mind, remember it's not the Western concept of mind. It's a little different concept of mind. So the mind-body system is centered here. It includes this. Interestingly, They didn't start to work at all on logical, analytic, deductive, or conceptual skills until the age of 8 or 9. Because the understanding was, until that age, the child is really not ready to do that. Which today, most developmental psychologists would agree with completely. You know, forcing children to read too early affects their eyes. Okay? Forcing, just like if we have a parent who tries to get their child to walk too early. You know, from a developmental standpoint, crawling on all fours is absolutely critical for the development of the neuroanatomy. And if you try to walk too soon, there's a lot of basic aspects of the neuroanatomy that do not develop quickly. Nature knows. Children start all fours because these movements are absolutely crucial for the development of the neuroanatomy. Well, similarly, if you try to force kids to read too early, it affects their eyesight. It focuses them in very narrow ways rather than the kind of peripheral vision that you really need to be a healthy human being. So I just use this to illustrate. This is one school. It's only one school. It has big influence. Educators from all over China come to study this school, but it was officially sanctioned by the party for the first time since the Cultural Revolution. There's a real opening in China, as I think there is all around the world. People are worried about the way the schools work. What you said is the most common worry. Competitiveness. Is our education competitive? I'd like to come back to that, because that's actually a historical question. You have to understand the historical context for that question. Okay, so I want to just talk for a few minutes about the history of the modern school. When I say modern, I mean the modern urban school system. It's not that old. It's 150 to 200 years old, that's it. The first modern urban schools were in England, Northeast United States. Well, a little bit later in the United States, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. That's the beginning of the 19th century, 1810, 1820, 1830, 200 years ago. You go back in Manchester, England, London, England, you had modern urban schools starting up maybe 30 to 40 years earlier. Okay? So it's very important to recognize that what we call the school system, the modern school system, is not very old. And it's a product of history. It's very important to understand the historical context within which it developed. Because once it started to develop, it became the mindset of all of us. We all, well, I don't know, I'll just assume, almost all of us went to the same school. How many of you went to a school that had grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4? How many of you went to a school like that? Okay? That's what I mean. Think about it. What does that sound like? Grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, grade 6. That's where it ended traditionally. It ended at grade 6. What does that sound like? It's an assembly line. Literally. The modern urban school was modeled after the most successful institutional innovation of the era, the assembly line. Why? First, it was the internet of its age. The assembly line transformed society. Productivity, labor productivity in England went up 150 times between 1750 and 1820. It was a profound improvement in productivity. That led to a huge increase in wealth and eventually income, and by the middle of the 19th century, you had the beginnings of the middle class. There was no middle class in Europe as there was anywhere in the world because you didn't generate enough wealth. Why did you generate that much wealth? Because the assembly line was the core of the industrial